Christine Schneider, the Visceral Voice.
Welcome to the Visceral Voice Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Schneider. Every 2 weeks on this podcast, I talk with voice specialists, manual therapists, health specialists, psychotherapists, movement practitioners, and professional voice users about voice science, function, medication, movement, puberty and aging, and everything in between. I am on a quest, not only to become a better manual therapist, but also to learn everything I can about the living, breathing body and its intricate connection to the voice. This podcast documents the continuation of my learning and my experience as a professional singer, a nutritional consultant, and a manual therapist. Join me every 2 weeks as we strive to provide current, knowledgeable, creative, and compassionate information to help restore, regain, and create happiness and success in your vocal journey. Hello, everyone. If you haven't already filled out the questionnaire, please do so. This really gives me ideas of what direction to take the podcast in, and I really appreciate your ideas. So thank you for filling out the questionnaire for those who have, and thank you for those who are going to. If you enjoy this podcast and you would like to become a supporter for a donation of $5 a month, you not only get my complete gratitude, but you also get to send in your questions for my guests. You can find a link for Patreon in my show notes. Thank you so much for considering becoming a supporter of the Visceral Voice podcast. I am very grateful for your consideration. I hope that you continue to enjoy the episodes. Please give me your feedback, and I look forward to hearing from you. Jessica Wolf has been teaching the Alexander Technique for 40 years and created the Alexander Technique program at Yale School of Drama in 1998. She is the founder and director of Jessica Wolf's Art of Breathing, a postgraduate certification training program for Alexander teachers. She is also a certified Laban movement analyst. Jessica created the first three-dimensional animated film of the respiratory system, which has since been translated into Spanish, Chinese, and German. She frequently contributes articles to professional journals and published a book, Jessica Wolf's Art of Breathing, Collected Articles. Other faculty appointments include the Aspen Music Festival, the Juilliard School, SUNY Purchase, Circle in the Square Theater School, Hunter College, Sarah Lawrence College, and the Verbier Music Festival. Jessica coaches many performing artists who appear on and off Broadway and in films and television. She also trains executive leaders in compelling presence. Her work is recognized internationally, and she travels extensively, giving workshops to performers, teachers, and healthcare providers. I am really excited to bring you my conversation today with Jessica Wolf. Hi, Jessica. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Christine. Happy to be with you.
I'm so happy to have you with me. We met a few years ago from a mutual friend, and I was so excited to be introduced to you. I had already had your animated video on breathing, and it was just so exciting getting to meet you. And I am really thrilled that you are here to talk with me in this series of Breath today about the art of breathing. So thank you for being here. So you are an internationally recognized teacher of the Alexander Technique. Can you talk to us about your journey into becoming one of the most sought-after teachers in this method?
Well, when I was 16, I was in a car accident, and I'm so old that way back when we weren't wearing seat belts. So my face hit the windshield, my throat hit the dashboard, and my neck whiplashed. I was sewn up, and then I was told to just give myself some vocal rest. I was told to hang from the door in traction. People don't do that anymore either. Telling a teenage girl to go on vocal rest is like telling somebody, not to wake up in the morning and make themselves a cup of coffee or tea. It's just not going to happen. So I pushed. I used a lot of muscle to make sound. And I made it through many years of pushing, but it was exhausting. And on some level, I healed. But it wasn't until an improv class that I was taking at Tisch School of Arts, NYU, And it was sometime in the early 70s, maybe 73. I was taking a class with Meredith Monk. She was experimenting with sound and movement, and she was encouraging us all to make sound as we made these big movements, and nothing came out of me.
Mm.
And it was at that moment that I realized that I had been holding on to this traumatic moment in my life. I hadn't really confronted it. And so I was young then anyway. Maybe it was too hard for me to do it then. But I began to ask around friends for help, and somebody suggested the Alexander technique. And I scheduled a lesson, took lessons privately for almost 2 years before I was accepted into the training program.
Mm.
I trained at the American Center for the Alexander Technique in New York City from 1974 to 1977. And that was the beginning of my journey.
Wow. Wow. And now Alexander had kind of a similar
Yes,
incident, right?
yes.
Yeah.
So he was a Shakespearean actor growing up in the outback of Australia. And he wanted to do public recitation. And he found himself in the act of speaking on stage, forcing himself to project. And
Mhm.
he lost his voice. First, he went hoarse, and then he lost his voice. And at that time, there wasn't anyone that he saw in the medical profession that could help him other than to suggest vocal rest. And he tried it, but as soon as he got back on stage, halfway through his monologue, he would lose his voice. So he then spent, somewhere the story is told, almost 9 years observing himself in front of a mirror.
Mm.
He observed in himself this habit of pulling his head slightly back behind his neck and compressing his spine, which caused a lot of pressure in his torso and forced him to grab in his legs. All
Mm.
of this happening on the outside. On the inside, he was holding his breath. He was tightening around the ongoing movement of the breath.
Mhm.
And he observed himself in the act of speaking, and he noticed that he could change it when he found this very delicate release of the head, this new equilibrium where the head balances on top of the spine differently than it had been, and the entire body releases into width and
Mm.
depth and length as he began to feel his toes lengthen and stop grabbing and his feet contact the floor and accept the support from the floor so that his legs didn't have to have that gnarly sense of muscling.
Mm.
And so he too, yeah, he had vocal problems, and he was driven to make a change.
Isn't it amazing that both of you came to this incredible body work through your voice?
Yes, it's so fantastic that I can imagine I'm in his category. I'm in his circle of people who had got so much help, but I also had another helper, and I really want to mention him. His name was Carl Stow,
Mm.
and Carl was an extraordinary genius. His work started out as a choral conductor in North Carolina, and Carl began to listen to the voices of his singers. And he found that whenever they went up on a line of music, or when they would lose their pitch and their harmony among each other, it was often because they held their breath or interfered with their breath.
Mm.
And so his career started from the place of music. He had perfect pitch. He then was asked to observe and to assist in veterans hospitals and to work with some of these men in the late 50s, early 60s who had emphysema. And emphysema is a respiratory disease that is sadly the end of the road for a lot of people because the lungs lose their elasticity.
Mhm.
And he was involved with studies with patients who were overbreathing. They were actually taking in more air than they needed, and it created a suffocating effect. So
Mhm.
he didn't know what he was doing, but he just thought, maybe I can ask one patient to let their breath out. And he put a hand on one man who was lying in a bed, right over his chest, and he said, just go ahead and let your breath out. And a smile appeared on that man's face. And that patient was able to then receive the breath that was returning in a really satisfying way.
Mm.
So Carl was very interested on the turnover of air, the exhalation that would lead to the inhalation.
So important. And yet he was doing it so long ago.
I know. He was saying, well, you can't fill lungs that are already full. You've got to
Yeah.
let something out first. So, anyway, I knew that I needed more work, and I knew that my Alexander training was just so wonderful, but that somehow meeting Carl Stow for the first time, I wanted to continue for a lifetime with him. And I was lucky enough to be mentored by him for 20 years before he passed away in the year 2000. And he gave me permission to use his work to inform my work as an Alexander teacher. And the name, The Art of Breathing, or now Jessica Wolf's Art of Breathing, was taken from F.M. Alexander, who also called his work early on The Art of Breathing.
Mm. So wonderful. So can you tell us about your work in the art of
Yes,
breathing?
of course. So it's a hands on technique. It's a very sacred, quiet time when I ask my students to begin to leave themselves alone so that they can begin to acquire sensation of three-dimensional shape change inside their body. So breathing is movement.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us have at one time or another muffled that sensation of internal movement. And so I want to get that back, that ease of the breath returning in response to the breath that moves out. I put my hands on and I listen with my hands
Hmm.
to the shape change. And I encourage always, no matter who it is, I encourage my students to invite their breath to their back, because that back motion, that activity in the back, eases up some of that accessory breathing, neck and shoulder accessory breathing that may have occurred in the front of their body, all that
Mhm.
grabbing for air. So once I begin to feel under my hands that there's some vitality, that there's something returning, I ask my students to let their breath out and to follow their breath to its natural conclusion. Not to squeeze it out, not to push it out, just follow it out. And that's all about beginning to get this perpetual motion, this ongoing shape change and ongoing breath. The breath that's returning is returning in response to the breath that just was let out. We start to count silently. Counting silently is kind of sloppy. No enunciation is important. Just silent counts out 1 to 10, 10 plus another 5, whatever it is, until the student begins to feel how that innate reflex can begin to happen for them. And it's stimulated, and the air comes in without, in capital letters, taking a breath.
Mhm.
So the key that I always say to the coordinated breathing is the easy exhalation that prompts a full and easy inhalation.
Mhm. So, within that coordination, can we talk a little bit about breathing synergistically and finding a coordination that allows the respiratory system to function at a maximum efficiency with minimum effort?
Right. Now, those were Carl's words.
Yeah.
Um, and he believed that in order for that to happen, we had to reduce the muscular tension around breathing, around our familiar habits of breathing, which are often rigid and fixed and quite binary, that we come from a place of thinking we're going to breathe in, we're going to breathe out. But what Carl was interested in for maximum efficiency and minimum effort was this idea of the turnover of air, the easy idea that it's a cycle, it's like a wheel. You're either at the beginning, middle, or end of your exhalation, or the beginning, middle, or end of your inhalation. And it eliminates, it's quite efficient because it eliminates the stopping, the getting ready, the onset. Oh, I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to begin to speak. I'm going to begin to sing. It's not that at all. It's truly this idea that the breath is always in motion. The primary muscle of respiration, the diaphragm, is always in motion. There are many, many secondary muscles of respiration, but the diaphragm is always in its excursion. And as long as we're alive, there's motion in the diaphragm and mobility in the ribs and the spine. So one of the things that makes me a little crazy, I have to just mention, is when people come to me and they say, I hear you teach diaphragmatic breathing. And I want to laugh because the diaphragm is moving on every breath we take, whether we're doing it efficiently or not. The diaphragm is moving. So I'm not teaching any diaphragmatic breathing, but I can help people restore their respiratory system for more vitality and more calm by simply getting them to begin to redevelop this coordination.
You mentioned diaphragm and excursion. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes. So we don't feel it. It's way below our level of sensation, but our diaphragm originates on our lumbar spine and it travels up the lumbar spine. And then when it meets the 12th thoracic spine vertebrae, which is the beginning of the vertebrae or the very bottom of the vertebrae that the ribs attach to, that diaphragm muscle then begins to sew itself to the bottom of all those ribs at the very bottom. We can trace them by taking our fingertips, digging a little, and feeling just at the level of our waist where the bottom of the ribs are. Diaphragm is sewn onto the bottom of those ribs all the way to the front, bottom of the sternum, right to this little floating bone in our costal arch called xiphoid process. And so it's a huge muscle because it's anchored on the lumbar vertebrae and it comes up. Now, in the middle of that muscle, there is a tendon. It's called the central tendon. And it descends and rises all day long. When it descends, we feel the volume of our ribs changing shape. When it rises and starts to dome up, we feel the draping of the ribs as they change shape. When the diaphragm descends and that central tendon flattens like a dinner plate and spreads wide through the diameter of the ribs, the lungs now have more room, so the air comes rushing into those lungs beautifully and they change volume, they change shape. And then when the diaphragm starts to dome back up, it's guiding the air out of the lungs.
So within that, we can talk about a visceral internal massage. I love this in your book. I love that you talk about this because I talk about this all the time. So could you just elaborate on the idea of a visceral massage through breath?
When I talk about the visceral massage, I am talking about the movement of the diaphragm, descending and spreading and rising and doming. And this ongoing movement massages all of the internal organs. So below the diaphragm, but still within the ribs, is the liver on the right side and the stomach on the left side, and lots of intestines in the front. In the back, we have all of that plus the spleen and the kidneys. So that literally, when that diaphragm descends, it just puts the smallest little bit of pressure on all the organs below, and the circumference of our torsos change shape. Now, this is micro movement, so we don't necessarily feel it in our normal day unless we take time to do a lie down and really listen for the shape change. But when that diaphragm does descend like that, it is causing a shape change inside the body of the viscera below, which is so wonderful for digestion and elimination, for our well-being, because when the entire circumference of the torso is changing shape, you can begin to get a sense consciously of how internal shape change enlivens the body. We get very close to the impulses of our body that's way down low below our belly buttons. And we can feel when we're holding the breath.
Mm-hmm. So staying with the diaphragm for a moment, but moving on to more emotional, you sometimes talk about the importance of recognizing the breath as a means of expression and learning why the diaphragm is the muscle of emotion. Can you elaborate on the diaphragm as a muscle of emotion?
Yes. There's an intimate connection between our nervous system and our respiratory system. And it doesn't hurt to repeat, the diaphragm is the primary muscle of respiration. It's lying just below our heart and just above our stomach, inside our ribs. And as I've described, it's always in motion. We all hold our breath in response to heightened emotion, and then we can return to the ongoing motion of the diaphragm. But what happens to many folks who don't recognize breath holding as a habit, their diaphragms lose tone, and the diaphragm actually becomes less responsive to what we're feeling and thinking. And we have both physical and emotional manifestations of surprise, joy, anxiety, fear, regret, and can learn to recognize their impact on our respiratory system. Because you know the breath of ease and satisfaction after a kitchen cleanup or a performance to be proud of.
Mm-hmm.
But we've also had the experiences that come out of nowhere. We check in on our phones and we get a text from our partners saying, "We need to talk." And we go to our email and we get caught up in the latest tweet storm that takes over the news feed. Your heart leaps and it's into your throat, and your stomach clenches, and breathing stops. The relationship between stress and breath is reciprocal. Heightened emotion is sure to disrupt our breathing rhythms. And when that cycle is disrupted, our anxiety goes up. And in the same way, reestablishing our natural breathing rhythms can help restore emotional balance. So, from an early age, and certainly as an adult, we have moments of giddiness and laughter. And my imagination is that the diaphragm is just bouncing happily inside. And then we have tears and sobbing cries. And I imagine the diaphragm moving with extreme fullness and depth at those moments. When we are anxious, we lose control over our breathing. We feel like we need to muscle the breath, and that's that diaphragm being interfered with. We feel like we need more breath. And when we muscle, we're using unnecessary energy, which is at the expense of our poise, our alignment, our balance. And when we feel depressed, our breath becomes dull and our sensations are muffled because we don't have the movement of the diaphragm. There is a general collapse in the physical body. Fear tightens everything up. Anger does the same thing and hardens the body. The diaphragm has nowhere to move. We're squeezing and holding and hardening everywhere. And that's when our fight or flight mechanism is triggered relentlessly. After working with me for several years, an actor told me, this is interesting, that he's better able to bring attention to his body and his breath, whereas before, he noticed that when something welled up inside him, he would tighten his belly, which he knew inhibited the movement of the diaphragm. And then he would have a panic breath and gulp in air, which stifled his emotions. So now, after training his body kinesthetically to recognize tension, he's able to find a much freer connection to himself. Simply put, he just needed to notice, to get out of the way, and allow the involuntary system to coordinate and move. The diaphragm cannot be moved voluntarily. We have to just leave it alone, let it respond to a stream of impulses, emotions, and imagination. And breath truly is the key to restoring our deepest connections. The diaphragm lives deep, deep inside our bodies.
How beautiful. So, how do we learn to not hold our breath, but rather release it, and yet do less with the breath to reach peak efficiency?
We have to learn to trust it. And trusting it just doesn't come down from the heavens and we absorb it. It's not like that at all. It's a tremendous journey. We have to practice getting out of our own way. Now, we're all creatures of habit, and habit is unconscious. So we have to first become aware. We have to recognize how we are holding back from the experience of breath. And we have to learn to substitute our breathing coordination for capacity. So I know that it's hard to imagine that in doing less, you can find so much more ease. But that is what this is about. 1% less every day will give you an experience that that allows you to find quality and sustainability of your sound without doing so much. There's too much muscling, too much efforting that we do, and that interferes with efficiency, especially peak efficiency when we're singing and speaking long phrases, whole notes. You really have to know how a thought can influence the body. Because in the Alexander technique, it is psychophysical work.
Yeah, definitely. So, in your book, you state the signature idea of the Alexander technique is this: how we use our bodies affects how we function. Therefore, misuse causes malfunction. We all have unconscious movement habits, and habit is powerful. Can you discuss the powerful influence of unconscious movement habits?
So if you're listening right now and you're sitting, you might want to notice if your neck feels collapsed or your ribs feel collapsed. That's an unconscious habit that often doesn't register because we're so familiar with it, but it minimizes the turnover of air in the body because it puts pressure on the respiratory system, downward pressure, and the body loses its resilience until we start to notice this misuse.
Mm-hmm.
So the misuse can cause malfunction, but generally we don't notice the misuse or the malfunction until it interferes with our coordination or it causes pain.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the problem. I was saying before that habits, they develop over time. And we often block the information from the inside world of our bodies. And we ignore our sixth sense. Our sixth sense is our proprioception, our kinesthetic sense, the feedback we're getting. So whatever we have become begins to feel normal. For example, again, if you're sitting and listening to this, you may notice that you have a habitual twist to the left. And that will feel familiar and regular and balanced. So if I was to help you to undo that twist, you may begin to feel like you're twisted to the right until the new pattern becomes familiar. And same goes if we've muffled breath to ignore pain. We have to awaken and find the movement of the breath, which at times can lead to sensations of discomfort. But because I would never take it any further than the individual could go, we always back off if it's too much, and then we pick up again. So, well, let me just say this as well. We have a lot of stress in our lives. Haha, that's the understatement. And recognizing some of the common patterns, such as tensing your neck, holding your breath, tightening your jaw, lifting your shoulders, narrowing, restricting in your lower back, tight hips, compressed spine, locked knees. All of these habits are going to interfere with your breathing, your singing, your movement, the way you think, the way you want to find your impulses. And if these habits are present and you think of correcting the habits by doing something else, you're going to just magnify the original habit by layering on something else. Alexander teachers work with a principle called inhibition. It's not Freudian. It's a way of pausing for a nanosecond, and we ask ourselves to stop and substitute, make a choice. Maybe I can do it differently. And often differently is doing less.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the most common movement habits that you have come across or that you see?
I think the habit, the head neck relationship, that's what I'm going to refer to it
Mm-hmm.
as. Our spines travel up behind our tongues, up behind the roof of the mouth, almost up behind the nose. So when we allow the breath to come in through the nose, that breath is brushing the top of our spines. Not for real, but it's a great image so people know where their head-neck relationship originates. When the head pulls back and down on a singer, there is a tremendous weight, 10 to 12 pounds of bony skull on the vertebral column. Of course, the
Mm-hmm.
body's going to feel compressed. When the head pulls back and down on the spine, it also closes off the back of the throat. So the airway and all the vocal cartilage feel constricted. Another habit that's automatic and familiar is one where people drop their pelvis slightly forward and lock their knees back. That can be a difficult pattern because from the top to the bottom, that can interfere with the three-dimensional torso, this breathing container, having the ease and the space to move.
Mm-hmm. With the head and neck, you were saying pulling back and down. Are you talking about a forward head shelf?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you take your two fingers of one hand and place it right at the hollow at the base of your skull, at the top of your neck, and you drop your head back ever so slightly, the neck begins to goose forward.
Mm-hmm.
Can you feel that?
Mm-hmm.
That weight of the head back and down starts to tighten and tug on the tongue. What I'm interested in doing is suggesting an ease to the head, a new balance, a poise of the head on top of the spine, located way up behind the roof of the mouth, way up there behind the nose, so that when you gesture yes, the smallest tipping of your head, or you say no, your face can turn, the back of the head can move. That's where
Mm-hmm.
the head balances.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jessica's talking about that occipital cranial base, that compression happening in there, which can jut the jaw and the head forward,
You
but
got
add
it.
compression at the occipital cranial base. Yeah. Great. Okay. Let's move on to my signature questions.
Okay.
What is some advice that you would like to give to an aspiring young performer?
The mantra that I say to myself all the time and I suggest to my students is I have time. So I have time to be fully present. And I believe that presence is transformative. So I check in with my breath and I always say, I can change my attitude toward time. I can always be in the moment.
Wow. I really needed to hear that today, Jessica. Thank
Oh,
you.
good.
That's a good one. What is your favorite quote?
My favorite quote is Mark Twain's quote. He says, habit is habit, and not to be flung out of the window, but coaxed downstairs a step at a time.
Mm. What are your favorite song lyrics?
Well, that's a tough one for me, but when I think about it, I suppose it's Stevie Wonder, and it's an old song. You are the sunshine of my life. I danced with my husband at my wedding many years
Mm.
ago, and I'm still married. So I love that
Hmm.
song.
Yes. That's so beautiful. Who influenced your teaching the most?
Oh, I'm such an amalgamation of so many people and things. You know, I think teachers evolve. We evolve with our work, and you know what it's like. We're still learning all the time. So, right now, I am totally digging this pure movement work. It's work that is based on swings and undulations and bounces, all movements that help to release the breath. And I'm collaborating with a friend of mine in the UK. Her name is Jackie Snow. And we're just expanding this concept of movement for actors. So I'm really loving that right now.
That's wonderful. What is something new about the voice that you have learned this week?
Yes, I have been very interested in the unconscious holding in the pelvic floor. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm beginning to understand when there's respiratory function, dysfunction, we have to really see the whole of ourselves and begin to experience and find any interference with the rhythm of the breath in the pelvic floor.
Mm-hmm. What is one item you could never live without?
Well, coffee in the morning, and a piece of foam for my head to use as a support when I do my Alexander lie downs, when I get in touch with my breath and I work on myself. I like to have my head supported just maybe an inch with a piece of foam.
Mm. Any particular foam? Can you get
No,
it anywhere or
yeah,
just
you can pick up a piece of foam in, well, you'd have to go online and find places that make it, but you can cut it into pieces, and you just want a small paperback book size that you can carry around with you so you can do a lie down for 10 minutes and just find some ease. restore your balance.
Mm. What is one thing you have on your bucket list?
That is so easy for me. The answer is to travel wherever there is warm water, because I love to swim, and I think I may have been a mermaid in my previous life.
I love that. And my daughter will too.
Oh, good. She's a swimmer.
She
Oh,
is. She's a little mermaid.
so good.
What is the most delightful word you can think of?
Two of them. Resiliency and buoyancy. Or resilience and buoyancy.
What is your favorite book?
I don't have a favorite book, but I'm reading an amazing book right now called The Body, and it's a guide for occupants. It's by Bill Bryson, and it's this journey about something that we all have, but we all take for granted. And it's got all this arcane and fascinating information, and it's enjoyable and it's educational, and I'm just nerding around with it. I'm loving it.
Oh, The Body. How wonderful. What are you currently learning?
Oh, Christine, I have just started in the last year a scholarship fund for training people of color to become Alexander teachers. And yeah, I'm learning how to run a nonprofit, and just knowing that the Alexander community needs new role models and that diversity really matters to us, and trying to get this thing off the ground, it is proving to be a huge learning curve.
What do you wish that you would have learned sooner?
To get out of my own way, not to be such a critic, the judgmental critic, the background noise. It just pulls back on the reins and just is not a place for anybody to go to. When we find our inner critic, we really have to quiet that person. She's noisy. And I'm still working on her because she's still distracting to me. And I think it's through my breath, because from moment to moment I can come back to my own presence.
If the listeners want to get in touch with you, what is the best way they can do that?
You can email me or go to my website. So my website is jessicawolfartofbreathing.com. My email is jessicawolf170@gmail. And my new scholarship, I got to plug it, is the Judith Leibowitz Scholarship.org, but that's on my website, so you could see everything in one place.
Oh, so wonderful, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the art of breathing. It has been such a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for being here.
It has been my pleasure.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with those you know. You can also subscribe, rate, and write a review. If you want to connect with me, you can now find me on Instagram under The Visceral Voice. You can find me on Facebook under my name or under Lifelight Massage, or you can check out my website at lifelightmassage.com. Please join me in 2 weeks for another wonderful conversation on The Visceral Voice.